All right. Well, I want to get started right at 5:30 because we want to have plenty of time for our discussion. Um, I want to welcome all of you, both here, when we actually have several people here in the room with us, as well as tuning in online, to Still Indivisible, Assessing the Current State of American Democracy. I'm Dan Ponder. I'm a professor of political science and international affairs here at Drury, and I'm the director of the Metter Center. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this discussion. I first would like to thank Dr. Tim Cloyd and our provost, Beth Harville, and others who kind of came up with the general idea for this and asked the Metter Center if we could put something together, and we were certainly pleased to do that. I do want to say that feel free, those of you who are in the room, feel free to ask a question, indeed about anything on your mind. I'm going to, just so everybody knows, I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of talking about, all of the panelists kind of got together, talked about some points we wanted to make. I'm going to briefly summarize those. Hopefully it'll take no more than 6 or 8 minutes, and then after that, the plan is just simply to open it up for the rest of the time to questions. If you are online, you can submit a question, which will then be relayed to the panel by Mike Brothers. So feel free to do that. He'll be fielding those and passing those along. Okay. Here at the beginning of the third, I'm going to read this, and I apologize, but that's the best way for me to not go off into Neverland, and we can get done and we can get to your questions. So I beg your pardon. Here at the beginning of the third decade of the 21st century, and in the wake of the tumultuous years in American politics, and many of the individuals that are involved, including voters, politicians, government institutions, extra-government institutions such as the media and political parties, and for the first time, we have failed to have a truly peaceful transfer of power in light of the events of January 6th. We have a partisan split in Congress with Democrats holding the slenderest of slender majorities. We arguably have not 2, but 4 parties, as each grapples with its internal dynamics and choosing or evolving what type of party it wants to be. Public trust in government continues to be low, which historically has not proven terribly sustainable, and in some instances has called even legitimacy into question. There are many, many trends and undercurrents to consider, and we have a panel of experts from several disciplines across Drury University. And I want to thank and introduce our panelists briefly. Greg Booker is an associate professor of communication. Jonathan Groves is chair of the Department of Communication. Jennifer Jocelyn is the director of the Compass Center here at Drury. Justin Lineweaver is an associate professor of political science. Janice Pruitt is an attorney and professor of management. Unfortunately, she is ill and is unable to join us, so we will miss her perspective. Jeff Vandenberg is the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Affairs. Michael Verney is an assistant professor of history, and me. So I'm going to briefly summarize some of their comments and then quickly open it up for your questions. To begin with, we start with the observation that democracy, both as a concept and as an empirically identifiable form of government, is complex. It requires concepts and definitions and a concern about the erosion of formal and informal institutions or norms. Dr. Vandenberg made the observation that democracy is, as I said, is complex. What are its elements? How do we measure them to make an assessment of its condition? The panelists this evening are uniquely qualified to discuss many aspects of democracy, including the rule of law, civil rights, equality, erosion of commitments to democratic values at the popular level, challenges of information literacy, and so forth. Jeff also observed that there's been some democratic backsliding in the U.S., which is part of a disturbing broader trend. According to Freedom House, 2019 was the 14th consecutive year of global democratic decline, in which the number of countries experiencing declines in democracy outpaced the number of countries experiencing gains. There are many explanations for this, but one highlight is authoritarian learning, in which autocrats emulate one another's strategies for power consolidation. What we have witnessed over the past 4 years, culminating on January 6th, is straight out of that playbook, undermining the legitimacy of democratic institutions, attacking the press, demonizing the opposition, scapegoating segments of society, using violence and threats, and building a cult of personality around the leader, to name but a few. And as Professor Lineweaver observed, this was certainly not a peaceful transfer of power by any stretch of the imagination. Others, such as Drs. Grove and Jocelyn, note that though we tend to focus on traditional journalism as the source of our news, the reality is most of us are getting information and often misinformation, filtered through and recommended by our social media channels. These channels and their algorithms are often abused by those wanting to spread active misinformation or disinformation, which plays on our beliefs and emotions. It's ever more important to be aware of where the information we consume originates and how we can vet that information before sharing or spreading it. We should also be cognizant of how the headlines, photos, videos, and articles we engage with are working on our emotions. Most people are more emotional and perhaps less rational actors. Professors Jocelyn and Booker, as part of minority communities, LGBTQIA+ and African American respectively, observed that they have been increasingly marginalized in recent years, and they offer perspectives that speak to this moment in time. They also have observations on how the last several years have impacted not only themselves, but students that they interact with. Dr. Verney is an historian who sees a number of parallels between the politics of the Civil War era and the present moment, and that he'd be happy to elaborate further on that contextualization for the audience. The takeaway, though, he says, we're not quite in Civil War territory yet, but our politics have unfortunately returned to a lesser form of the kind of acrimony that we saw in the early Republic and in the mid-19th century. As I said, Professor Pruitt won't be able to be with us tonight, but her background is she's a lawyer as well as a professor of management, and her focus kind of interacts with mine on institutions. And she indicated that she sees a lot of misinterpretation, misunderstanding, and misapplication of the U.S. Constitution in the last several years. I spend a lot of my time focusing on political polarization. And while that does not necessarily preclude democracy, it certainly exacerbates divisions in the exercise of democratic processes. For example, data show fewer and fewer people live in communities that are politically competitive. By 2016, more than 60% of voters lived in counties where the winning candidate received at least 60% of the vote. Even more striking, 21%, more than 1 in 5, lived in counties where the winning candidate won by 50% of the vote. That is at least 75-25, which means we are talking to, meeting with, seeing, interacting people that disagree with us less and less. We see this as well in presidential outcomes by state, as fewer and fewer are competitive. In 1960, now these are admittedly arbitrary, but if you look at levels of competitiveness, high, moderate, low, and very low. Let's just look at high and low competitiveness. High competitiveness would be where a candidate, regardless of whether he won or lost the actual presidential election in a state, won by around 0.1 to 5%. In 1960, 20 states were highly competitive. 9 were not very competitive. In other words, where the winner there won by more than 15%. In 1976, those numbers were roughly unchanged. But starting in about 2000, and certainly leading up to today, whereas in 1960, 20 states were highly competitive, only 8 in 2020 were. On the other hand, in 1960, where only 9 states had very low levels of competitiveness, in other words, greater than 15%, 9 states in 1960, 11 in 1976, 30 in 2020. And in fact, I did these numbers the other night, and I also looked, 14 states, plus the District of Columbia, the winner won by at least 25%. So more and more states are not competitive. And still, states have sought to roll back voting. The Brennan Center recently reported that thus far this year, barely a month into it, 28 states have introduced, pre-filed, or carried over no fewer than 106 bills to restrict voting access. These proposals primarily seek to 1. Limit mail voting access, 2. Impose stricter voting ID requirements, 3. Limit successful pro-voter registration policies, and 4. Enable more aggressive voter roll purges. So, where do we go from here? What reforms, institutional or otherwise, might work? What might the parties do? Do politicians have agency? These and other topics, whatever you want, are what we address tonight. With that, we want to open up the questions. First of all, we'll start with anybody in here, in the room, and then we'll move to online. Do any of you have questions, whether it's about this or anything else to deal with the current political system? Yes. Okay, yeah, to repeat the question is, we talk about democracy, but aren't we a constitutional republic? Yes, but we also talk about, when we're talking about, I think democracy is also a term that is used generally for the type of system that we have. In other words, we vote for representatives to represent us in some sort of legislature. Most democracies vote for an executive. There are protections for minorities, both racial, ethnic, and otherwise, as well as political minorities. There are often alternative forms of media and so forth. So I don't want to say that's a difference without a distinction, but for our purposes, and really a lot of the purposes in certainly the political science research that we do or that we read on a daily basis, it's roughly equivalent. So it's not clear that's a great point. It's not clear that would necessarily make a big difference in what we're discussing tonight. So thank you for that question. Yes?
So I'm kind of interested in the rise of conspiracy theories, seeing as we have communications professors, history professors, and political science professors here. But more so the rise of conspiracy theories as they relate to people holding them who end up becoming elected officials. Because I don't think that Republicans are more likely than Democrats inherently to believe conspiracy theories, right? As people, I think that we're all fairly equally likely to believe conspiracy theories. But why is it that we're seeing more and more conspiracy theories rise in like right-wing groups? Because whenever I take a cursory look at left elected officials, Democrats, I don't see a Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I don't see like different conspiracies being pushed in the same type of way.
Okay, the question is basically why has there been a rise in conspiracy theories, people believing conspiracy theories, and why does, at least in the current time, that tend to be concentrated in the right? Would anybody like to take a shot at that? Jonathan? Greg, you want to go? Oh, Greg? All right, we'll start with Greg.
Thank you for the question. I can only speak about it based on my life experiences. I used to listen to a lot of AM talk radio years ago, back in the 80s and 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and there has always been kind of on the right this distrust of institutions. So that was sort of fostered, has been fostered through the media for a long time. Initially, when I listened to AM shows, it was for entertainment. I could laugh at the people and their ideas and the lizard people and the whole thing, right? But then they started being taken seriously, and I think as we've had social media and folks have been able to sort of realize, hey, it's not just me that feels this way, it's these other people too. There gets to be sort of this community of like-minded individuals. AM radio has always been, at least as far as I'm aware, sort of populated by conservatives. So they were already sort of congregated in this sort of medium, right? I think there's also some studies out, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, that show that conservatives typically have something just hardwired in their brain that makes them a little bit more apprehensive and sort of distrustful, which is not a bad thing, but it also sort of plays into this distrust that we're talking about. So I think in that sense, it took a while to sort of build up, but it becomes this thing where you keep hearing about these people are bad, or those people are out to get you, or this thing happened and these people secretly killed somebody. And over time, decades, it turns into what we have today. I can't think of anything on the left that has mirrored that at all.
May I piggyback off of that? I think part of this, we need to look at the platforms that are available to us now. That has changed pretty dramatically in the last 10 years. And I would say we still have to consider that we're relatively new to how we're reacting to social media. So if you think, we're probably where people were with television in the 1950s. And so we're kind of finding our way with all these new platforms, and each day we're introduced to a new platform. Now everybody's talking about Clubhouse as the new place to try out and interact with other people and see what the conversation looks like. And unfortunately, the algorithms reward things that get traction. So if everybody starts talking about a conspiracy, it's elevated and spread in all these spaces that we're present in. And historically, when we've talked about the media, there's some level of verification that happens on a journalistic level. That doesn't happen on social media platforms. Now, anyone with a keyboard and a computer and a login can hop on there and say outrageous things and interesting things and captivating things and share photos that seem real. And we've got media tools that make it really easy to create misinformation that allows these conspiracy theories to spread. And it often is connected to how we react to it emotionally. So we're a little more vulnerable to it. So if I seem apt to want to believe something about Donald Trump or want to believe something about Joe Biden, or depending on where I align with that, if I see a meme or I see a video or I hear something, I may be more willing to spread it without checking where it came from. And I put it out there and I'm spreading it. So now what people see is the people on my Facebook page are seeing, hey, Grove shared this thing. It must be correct because he's a media professor, right? Where if I didn't do my homework and do that check-in, which most of us don't when we hit the share button, that's where we cause some problems. If you are on Twitter today, you will notice that a certain representative is trending on Twitter, and I'm not going to say her name because that's part of amplification. Every time her name is mentioned or put on Twitter or put on Facebook, that gives more oxygen to any conspiracy she might be spreading, and it just pops up because her name is the trend. And then all of a sudden everybody who's exploring say, I wonder what's trending, I'm looking at this, and then you go back in the conversation with your friends of, well, I saw something on Twitter about X, and it has this organic, natural spread that seems legitimate, and it's given the air of legitimacy that you wouldn't have had 20 years ago before we had social media platforms. So that's kind of the difficulty in today's environment.
Can I add to what Greg was saying? So I actually have explored the literature on this a bit. There's actually some lit that came in the American Journal of Political Science in 2016, 2017. Miller, Saunders, Farhart, their team did a series of experiments where they were looking to see, how does motivated reasoning play a role in why it seems like conservatives were more apt to conspiracy theory than liberals. And they found some really interesting results, though it's always tough to generalize from that kind of survey experiment, that they attributed it mostly to being the out party, right? This was, if you were the party, Obama was in office when they ran their experiment, and it was more about, we couldn't possibly have lost if this was just a straight up picking the right team, so something else is going on. And that seems to have made them more susceptible, according to these researchers. They also found that political knowledge actually made Republicans more likely to adopt or endorse conspiracy theories, and liberals the opposite. But again, they were attributing this to being the out party. I don't think their research saw the rise of Trump and the she who shall not be named I think that actually runs counter to the story they were trying to tell. But I think there's something to be said for something about our current atmosphere of lack of trust in institutions, motivated reasoning. We are way outside sort of historical precedents for this kind of thing. It's really quite scary what the research is starting to turn up.
I would say that the platforms are party agnostic. So how we react to trends and how we react to sharing and the level of verification that we are sometimes willing to do, I think that transcends party. I do think that I think you run into a situation that if it's something that's misinformation that reflects a belief that I have, regardless of my political stripes, I am more likely to share that than I would if it's got this affirmation piece to it. It's like, of course that's true, and I don't do the verification, I'm more likely to share it. And that's true across party lines.
So I'd like to jump in as the historian, especially since Professor Lineweaver mentioned historical precedent. I'm going to start with the American Revolution and work forward. So as far as the founding of the nation, I'd argue that conspiratorial thinking, anxiety is something that's kind of baked into our DNA, that the revolution in part grew out of this idea that there was a massive conspiracy on the part of George III and his ministers to really deprive the colonists of their liberties. And so we see that amplified throughout American history in the Civil War period, conspiratorial thinking about the slave power, trying to expand slavery all throughout the Union, and then the same in the South, the slaveholding South, viewing there being a free labor conspiracy. And so part of how we view things in our history is this idea that liberty is precious and it requires vigilance. And you have to be vigilant because it's very easy for powers to get corrupted who are going to move to steal liberty away. And I'd argue that's both a strength and obviously a weakness. And I think currently we're seeing more of perhaps the weakness element, and that this basic genetic tendency in the way that we view politics and government has really been exacerbated by many of the issues that my colleagues have listed here. But we're already kind of prone to this kind of thinking because we want to be vigilant about preserving liberty and Republican government or democracy or freedom, however you want to phrase it.
Yeah, thanks. I kind of want to push back on this idea that conspiracy theories lie with either more with the right or with the left. If you look historically, conspiracy theories were rampant in Russia before the revolution, attributing the power of the monarch and the power of the authoritarian regime there to conspiracies of different racial groups or different ethnicities involved. If you look at Pol Pot, they were full of all this kind of mythological conspiracy notions. And so I don't know that it would bear out in any kind of true way if we really did a close analysis of the history of kind of conspiracy theories. It seems to me that what we would see is people who feel that they've lost control over their lives and they're in a moment of desperation. There's a human tendency to want to create patterns that explain what's happening. And when you can't see or understand why these things are happening, your mind normally, as human beings, we try to put it in boxes and explain it. I actually had a second question, and this is from an article that came out yesterday in the Atlantic, and it's called "The Capitol Rioters Aren't Like Other Extremists," and it's by Robert Pope and Kevin Ruby. And what they did was they took the first 193 or 94 individuals who've been arrested by the FBI, and they took all the public records, and then they did their own deep dive into these people's internet accounts and everything to try to see whether or not these people shared a common ideology, or whether they shared affiliation with white supremacy, or whether they shared kind of being radicalized or identified as a militia group, et cetera, et cetera. And of the 193 that have been arrested so far, only 10%, one-tenth of them, have any connection at all to any kind of white supremacist group. It's amazing that most of these people actually are white collar workers. They have a lot to lose. And the puzzling thing is it does not fit into any categories that we've used. It was not all QAnon people that surf 4chan and 8chan and all these things. It's very difficult to get our handle on what is it. Is it a coherent ideology that produced these people to do this? Was it all white supremacy? Was it all? And the answer to that is no. Apparently, you ought to read this article in the Atlantic. It's pretty shocking. So, I wondered what you guys thought of that. And then, when we think about radicalization, we think that there's as much radicalization on the right as there is on the left, and how do we reach a common ground for discussion instead of vilifying and demonizing each other?
Who wants to take that?
I wasn't sure I heard the question part of that.
Yeah, I guess the basic question is, when we use categories of construction to create a reality that makes us feel comfortable, that seems to be a human thing.
Right.
But in the context of these riots that occur, the narrative that's been produced has been one of this was driven by white supremacists, by QAnon people, by militia people, and what the research is finding out for the first 193 people who've been arrested is that that's not true. There's only about 10% of the 193 that have been arrested have any affiliation with that whatsoever. So what's going on?
I would say that analysis is focused on those that were arrested, not everybody who was participating in the protests. So I would be cautious about how to interpret how are people seeing the messages around QAnon and the conspiracies and connecting that drove them to that space on January 6th. And then what were the things that ultimately pushed them over the line? And that's going to be very difficult to tease out because you've got, as you noted, 194 individuals, and they're going to have different reasonings. And I don't know that we have pure patterns for that behavior. But I think we can start to see in terms of when we look at images and information that people consume is, are we being built up in a situation where we have an enemy of some sort, or are we demonizing certain groups to blame for issues that we have? And I think that's where you see social media exacerbating that. Because if I'm, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's true. But what you have is a counter construction of an evil, an internal evil. Now you have to set up tribunals to go after that evil. That evil is, it seems like everyone wants to construct a demon or an explanation for what's happening. And maybe sometimes those categories of explanation don't work. They become ingrained in the media, and it
Right.
becomes this mantra, and it really doesn't. It's really not true if you dig down into that.
And I mean, this is where you're going to dig into the how to understand media effects research, right? How much are we affected by the images that we consume and the messages that we receive? And the literature is all over the place on this. So there's varying levels of media effects that we experience. So is it all because I saw it in a Facebook group? Is it all because I heard it through my friends. Is it all because I got activated by Twitter? Is it because I saw a YouTube video? I don't know. There's a complexity to these influences on us that led us to a group of people who were protesting, some of whom went over the line. And then we have group mentality that's at work, or the mob mentality, as they're swept up by the emotions.
Sorry, Jonathan.
Go ahead, chime in.
No, I just want to say, can I make I'll be the academic, like the dorky academic answer, which is like as the question is proposed, like I'm with you on some of the conclusions. I've got to read the research, the Atlantic article. I have some serious concerns generalizing. We know there were thousands of people involved. We know that the process of prosecuting has been selectively done. Some people are being prosecuted early for various things with the plan of using the grand jury to later layer on additional charges. We know some people are sort of like, the first 190 might not be a random sample of this group. So generalizing from even if we know what drove that 190, I'm not convinced that necessarily tells me anything about the broader group. But setting that aside, the sort of constructivist nature of where you're taking us, the securitization sense of this, I'm with you. There's a problem. Though I would want to push back, and I'd be curious to hear the questioner respond to, are you truly equating the levels of anti-government fervor between the left and the right at this point as being both equally problematic? I think the FBI tell us that we have a serious right-wing extremist problem in this country, and that the Antifa thing is more media narrative than it is an actual equal force to be afraid of. Right.
So I'm not grabbing equivalency, and I know there's problems with the statistical issue. Is that a representative sample? And how many people actually were there at the Capitol? We don't really know that number. Is it 800? Is it 1,000? 2,000? So yeah, I mean, but the point is that among the first 195 or whatever people that were arrested, there were physicians, there were professors, there were scientists, it was not sort of what you would imagine this group of people to be if you just operated out of a sheer presumptive bias, or implicit bias. You think these people were all from red states, they're uneducated, they're from rural communities, they're blue collar or whatever. But right now, the evidence doesn't seem to hold that up, to show that. So I don't know, I'll be interested to see, as these things progress, who these people were, and are they the same as what we would really think of as wherever these threats would emanate from?
Oh, no, sorry, I was just gonna try to clarify. Okay. So I think the differences between, like, when you mentioned Black Panther Party, so I think the equivalence that we could make is that both like the Black Panther Party and like the QAnon people want to like fight the system, but it's also pretty clear, like with the Black Panther Party, that the police were fighting back against the Black Panthers. Well, at least in the Capitol riots, there was very minimal like force being used on them. And so I think it is still a false equivalency between the conspiracies we see now and like something back then.
So this would be a left-wing conspiracy that would say there's collusion between the police and these white people that were rioting, and therefore you have, so that's another conspiracy theory that the left may be promulgating.
I understand your concern, but I think calling the idea that the police were acting back against the Black Panther Party a conspiracy is a bit misleading, because we have reports from the FBI of raids on Black leaders' homes that it resulted in the killing of Black civil rights leaders.
those aren't like, that's not from a liberal news source. We have FBI statistics saying that they police and go after black cultural leaders. And historically in this country, we have a history of overestimating the danger levels of minority radical groups rather than right-wing homegrown radical groups, even though abroad we generally think of the disenfranchised homegrown ex-military people as being higher threat. That statistic doesn't hold up here. And so even if you look at the admission of our government agencies, they maybe, you won't agree with me on the motives, but they'll admit that they took action against various black civil rights leaders. So I don't think calling that a conspiracy is fair.
The FBI infiltrated the Black Panthers. It's interesting to see in Maryland, or Philadelphia, this Proud Boy that they arrested. One of them was actually embedded in the Proud Boys, who was an FBI agent. So they had infiltrated those organizations as well. So yeah, I mean, there's no arguing that what happened in Chicago in 1968 was terrible.
A quick follow-up, and then we'll move on to other questions.
Oh yeah, this isn't really a follow-up, it's just a different question, if that's okay. Yeah. Cool. By the way, Dr. Cloyd, I'll check that article out. I just found it. It seems pretty interesting. So kind of looking at it from a more global perspective, something that was mentioned at the beginning of this was that globally, over the past 19 years, democracy in a variety of different democratic countries, at least like measures of democracy, I think you said Freedom House, I believe, they've all gone down. And I'm interested as to the professor's different explanations for that from all the different perspectives, I guess.
Jeff, that sounds like one for.
I can start, and then let me pass it along to others. I think so. The unsatisfying but true answer is that there's lots and lots of causes. I don't think we would, if we ascribe a kind of monocausality to it, we're doing it great injustice. So let me just list a few of the things that are going on there, and as possible explanations. There's no question that there's a kind of contagion or diffusion effect that happens. That is, there's the learning across countries, that there's influence that crosses over borders, and that a lot of the economic issues that sometimes drive this economic dislocation, frustration with the sort of anti-system frustration that is a ripe environment for authoritarianism or crosses borders. So there's economic variables that are going on. We already talked a little bit about how information consumption and social media can create, we think of it sometimes as a democratizing instrument, and in some instances it is, but it also has the capacity, both at the level that Greg and Jonathan and others have mentioned in terms of popular level, but also leaders themselves and regimes themselves have made great use of social media to consolidate power, to erode democratic norms and so on. So there's that as well. Also, sort of these things got really magnified in the aftermath of lots of questions about immigration and identity. So in Europe, for example, one of the animating phenomena behind authoritarianism is a kind of anti-immigration, anti-immigrant sentiment that was spurred in part by the refugee crises in the Middle East, for example. And anytime you see questions of identity and economy and immigration sort of mixing together, that's also a ripe environment for authoritarian trends or authoritarian leaders to take advantage of. Those are a few. Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to add into that? Yeah, please.
Well, I was going to reference a study somebody did. I heard last summer, and I'm sorry, I didn't realize I'd be quizzed on it later. But essentially, what they said was the world's a scary place. There are a lot of complex problems. We have global warming. We've got factions. We've got all these issues, and people just like someone who can tell them very simply, I will take care of your problems. And when you have someone who can simplify everything down to a couple of sound bites, some sort of bumper sticker slogan, you can kind of easily get behind that person and just say, you know what, I'm going to let you take care of it. I'm busy trying to raise my family. I'm trying to put food on the table, trying to live my life. And if you can help my life by getting rid of those people that are making my life bad, then go for it. And I think it's just simply sort of folks wanting to give control to somebody who will solve their problems.
There's a great book, I don't know if you've read it, it's called The Dictator's Learning Curve, which is what you've been talking about. There are consulting firms out of DC and other places that will go into countries, and on the one hand, they'll give the dictator, they'll bring them up to speed on how to use social media to trust them with democratic movement. And then at the same time, there's another consulting firm working with the Bud Stewart Rebellion, teaching them how to use social media to fight the dictators. It's just great stuff.
If I could break in here just a little bit, I do want to problematize this idea that Americans have always valued liberty and seen democracy as a precious commodity to protect. I just want to push back a little bit against that because, you know, the real issue is that not everyone's liberty is named, valued, codified into law, and that, you know, that's also the history of our country here. And also it's I just have to jump in here and note the binary of like Republican, Democrat, left, right, good, bad. You know, it just is probably is the LGBTQ voice here. I want to reinforce the nuance that that some people have introduced here. And also problematize this idea of protest. Like, not everyone has access to protest and protest narrative and protest literature. The carrying of guns into state legislatures versus the peaceful protest in streets. You know, America has a very troubled history of how they have responded and what they have named as protest and not named as protest. So I think there's a little bit more nuance here to add to this. I do want to point out that this notion of your civil liberties being dependent on who carries the popular vote and the electoral college, like this, the whiplash that our students face, that staff and faculty face, that citizens face when, you know, in the first 6 months of Obama's administration, there were same-sex rights or federal benefits allowed to State Department employees, for example, that acknowledged same-sex couples. The first day of the Trump administration, they removed all mention of LGBT people's policies, anti-bullying legislation from the White House website. And on the first day of the Biden administration, a reinstatement of anti-discrimination against LGBT people. I mean, those are real things that Black, Indigenous people of color, LGBT folks across the spectrum are surviving every day. So there's a very real toll to this idea that we codify laws and legal rights and legislation for certain members of the American family, but not universally. So just throwing that out.
I would piggyback off of that a little bit. I know that's the second time I've used that phrase. My apologies. It is related to some degree to what you're saying. I think, does everybody have equal access to participate? And I think if you look historically in terms of media circles, that hasn't always been the case. You had, you know, corporate structures and corporate media, and it was much more difficult to participate. Now, you would think with social media, that's a gold mine. Everybody can participate now. Everybody has a voice. That's why we saw things like the Arab Spring happen. But the problem with that is now you have concerted troll efforts to attack certain people who do rise and have influence. And if you look at traditionally those trolls, they're targeting women, they're targeting minorities, they're targeting all of these typically silent voices that now have a voice rather than the ones that are in power. And it's being used to assert power. The other problem we have is now we do not have sort of centralized ideas. It's much more difficult to have a complex conversation about something like healthcare or the environment because everything is so fragmented now. I just go to my favorite Facebook group and talk about all of the issues in this sort of smaller context rather than in the bigger context, which I think contributes to the conversation a little bit earlier about conspiracy theories, because it's easier to segment ourselves off into these groups to affirm, and it's almost like a little party. Hey, yeah, that's exactly what I think. That's exactly what I think. And there's a little bit of power even in a small group so that I don't have to listen to these other people, and compromise is less likely as it's been in the past.
Just really quickly to what Dr. Groves was saying. Used to be we had broadcasting. We had 3 sort of major news networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC. Now we have narrowcasting. And we don't all get the same general news now. We get very specific news, and if we feel a little bit uncomfortable with what one source is telling us, we'll go to somebody else who'll tell us the things that make us feel good. So that's correct.
We have a couple more students out here, and then we'll go to the web in a second.
I think that the extreme polarization in recent years is one of the major factors that have led to the political climate we see today. And we could talk about the reasons for that all day. But on the right, you see these waves of socialists trying to deconstruct the Constitution. And when you're on the left, you see white supremacists trying to undo civil rights. But I think we forget that these are our fellow Americans. These are our neighbors, our friends, our family. And so I want to know, where do we go from here? What can be done to get us out of this? What will it take?
Anyone?
I think before people make like really, because we're going to get some really touching answers to this, can I give like the not touching answer, or like a really down in the dirt, like as a political scientist, I'm telling you, if I could pick just one thing, it's not changing hearts and minds. We need the GOP to just get decimated in the next couple of elections. If we could simply send a signal that you cannot win by doubling down on anti-democratic vote restriction policy, if we can simply show we're stuck with a 2-party system. Duverger's law makes that pretty clear for us, unless we're going to change a lot of things. Jeff, that would be teeing you up. But short of that, if we could just get back to a system in which we punish the party who's in control when they do a bad job, I think we can rectify a lot without necessarily having to have a heart-to-heart with our uncle about the QAnon stuff he keeps sharing on Facebook. Like, if we could, but at this point, I think the last election shows us, and where state legislatures are going right now shows us, there aren't big penalties being paid in a lot of places for taking anti-democratic stances. And I think as long as that is true, I think we're in some serious trouble that doesn't require, like, are people at their core good or bad? Is that fair? Did I wildly trivialize a serious problem? I apologize.
No, but you fell right into the binary thinking that Jennifer's talking about. So you fell into the binary thinking that Jennifer's talking about. It's not about decimating the GOP as if it was a monolith. You know, you got to think about what are the subtleties, and maybe the LGBTQ community has something to teach us about moving away from these binaries and not looking at people as either victims or executioners.
Okay, so you
asked the $1 million question, obviously. What's to be done? And it's perhaps the most important question, honestly, because I think there's not too much disagreement that things aren't great right now. So what to do? And the list is long. I think, and also the way Justin framed it as, I mean, it's multi-directional. There's parts of this that are at the level of people and communities and ways of thinking and so on. But it's probably the political scientist in me. I tend to agree with Justin that one of the problems is in the nature of our institutions themselves, and the way we have elections, the way our institutions function. They incentivize, unfortunately. People tend to respond to structures and incentives, and our system incentivizes polarization. It rewards it. It amplifies it, and so it would not fix it perfectly, entirely, but changing some of those institutional arrangements that, for example, tend not to reward those on the extreme ends of the political party spectrum, and instead incentivize and reward those who are more willing to compromise, have electoral rules. Justin was teeing me up because he's heard me say this before. We should change the way we do elections. This is my perception. We should stop having winner-take-all elections. We should do away with them entirely. We need a proportional representation kind of model that allows other parties to have the chance of getting elected, and breaks out of this dichotomy of our binary thinking of a two-party system. I think just that by itself would do a lot. It would not be the magic formula. My colleagues can take over now on all the fixes that they've got teed up, but that would be how I'd start. Change the structures to disincentivize polarization and incentivize multi-partyism, compromise, moderation, and so on.
May I add one more piece or wrinkle to what can we do about this, which is, if you look historically, we need to think about how we can get information that we trust. We have so distrust for information, and if we don't have a free flow of information, we can't govern ourselves, and I think that's a huge problem. So, I mean, one of the reasons freedom of the press was enshrined in the Constitution is because of just that idea, the marketplace of ideas. Now, we have Section 230, this law that absolves the platforms of any text on their platforms, and now there is a real sort of rethinking of that law. And is this the right way to go? And maybe it's not the right way to go. And I think there has to be some level of accountability for platforms for the content that is on their platforms, which you are seeing that's come into the fore too, especially in this last year. I think because historically there's been accountability. Newspapers couldn't just publish whatever they wanted. They had to verify it. Broadcast stations will get their license pulled if they're not more careful with the kinds of things they're putting on their air. Why do we not have that level of accountability for the platforms which say, well, we didn't put that information up? I think there's a sense of responsibility that the platforms hold, especially since they hold so much power and have so many users. That's my 2 cents.
But Jonathan, wouldn't you say you would be empowering trial lawyers at that point to determine who has speech and who doesn't? Like, I just getting into a situation in which like Twitter has to put like a 48-hour hold on every tweet until it's been reviewed for possible lawsuits or the threat of law. I mean, Donald Trump's MO is to threaten lawsuits to stop things from happening.
Sure.
He could shut down opposition speech simply by making himself an annoyance to Twitter.
Right.
That concerns me as well.
And logistically, it's tough. And the other danger that you have is in authoritarian societies, social media is often the only way that you can get your voice out. I'm not saying there's an easy solution, but part of the problem is with this good-natured idea of letting everyone speak, which is where the internet started, right? I mean, the internet was good-natured back in the early 90s, and everybody had this grand idea of AOL chat rooms, and we can have fun talking to one another, right? It was like, we're just gonna work, there's this benevolence to the web, and there was a belief in that. Well, that's been hijacked. It's been hijacked by people who are actively putting misinformation and disinformation in these spaces, and they're using it to disrupt societies and disrupt democracies.
Okay, good.
So if we want to deal with that and help solve that problem, that's one of those issues that we have to figure out and think, why does it take 24 hours to take down a video that has active misinformation when it's very easy for them to identify something that's copyrighted and I can take it down like that?
Okay, I want to move on to another question.
Mad Men on, and I could take it down in a second. But if you're talking about the moon landing being faked, I'm going to be, it's going to linger in YouTube for a long time. So.
All right, we have another question out here. Hold on.
Thank you. I think we could all agree here that this country is in desperate need of unity. And if the GOP is decimated, can you make a case that would further divide the country?
Okay, the question was, we have talking about the system of decimating the GOP. So Justin, I think this may be for you. Wouldn't that exacerbate the problem of further dividing the country? Is that basically the correct? Okay, yeah.
I'd like to jump in on that question, and I do want to start by just acknowledging Jennifer's corrective to my early history. Thank you, Jennifer, for that. That liberty, frequently, unfortunately, in this country has also been a tool for oppression. And has worked to the benefit of oppressors. So thank you for the nuance. But as far as this question goes about whether or not decimating the GOP would be good for unity, I'm wondering, is there anyone in the room who is seriously wondering whether the January 6th Capitol riot would have happened if we didn't have a sitting president of the United States holding a Save America rally on the National Mall? And then telling the crowd that they had to get tough with these people, they had to march to Capitol Hill, and they had to tell them what they wanted. Like, is anyone actually thinking that would have happened out of the ether of that Q would have called for that and that actually would have happened? I think that we have to acknowledge that Donald Trump is a huge threat to our democracy, and that's why we're having this forum. And I, as a historian, this is supremely ironic to me. Historians love irony. We just get so excited about it. But that the party that was started in the 1850s and then came to prominence in 1860, and that had some of the most eloquent expressions about the need to acknowledge the Constitution, the need together to accept the dictates of a popular election, is now the party where a sitting Republican president later is trying to destroy that. I have a quotation for Abraham Lincoln for you. So this is Lincoln's first inaugural address. A majority held in restraint by constitutional checks and limitations, and always changing easily with deliberate changes of popular opinions and sentiments, is the only true sovereign of a free people. And whoever rejects it does of necessity fly to anarchy or to despotism. Either you accept the majority result of an election in a democratic system, or you fly to despotism, or you fly to anarchy. And so a very basic answer is that as a country, we have to come back to the principle that we accept the results of elections, we move forward. If we lost, we try to come up with better ideas to win at the polls in a truly democratic fashion. And we have to acknowledge that the current Republican Party and the current leader of the Republican Party, as much as Mitch McConnell wants to be, is not on board at that basic American principle. And we have to go back to the election of 1860 to find another instance where a vast proportion of the population did not submit to the election results. They accepted it, but then they said, well, now we have to leave. They didn't submit to it in terms of a peaceful transfer of power, and that is striking.
Yeah, I would just say, Vernie put that beautifully. That was really nice. I also love irony. I would say
from my perspective, one of the real drawbacks of the heightened level of partisanship that we see in our society is that somewhere along the line, not since the Civil War have we seen it to this level, Americans started thinking of their political party like their favorite baseball team. And that means that team can do no wrong. Its success is central to their identity. And whatever the leaders of that team tell me, that's what I believe. So if I say we need to see one of the political parties decimated in local, midterm, and presidential elections for a while to help them recalibrate away from their extreme edges, I'm not challenging any human being in America, their personal identity, or anything they believe in. Party and ideology are two fundamentally separate things. And when you track the parties and the positions they take on issues over time, you will see they're incredibly flexible in what they fight for, in the things that are deal breakers, right? Nixon's Republican Party is different than Reagan's Republican Party, is different than Trump's Republican Party, is different than George W. Bush's Republican Party. Nixon would be a dirty liberal for creating the EPA and all of his environmental things. I'm just saying, I think it's important for us as Americans, if we want to talk about unity, and that I think it's so important that we get back to what Vernie is saying. It's about a fundamental commitment to our community, to finding and creating rules that we can all live by and abide by. And the more we can push this sort of my team, their team, I'm going to vote straight down the ticket, I think the healthier we're going to be. And I think that's where Jeff's suggestion about institutional change, but the sort of prohibition on multi-member parties or districts in the House are, I mean, I think that's, Dan, I'll let Ponder correct me, but that's the 1960s that law gets passed. There are changes that we could make in law without having to amend the Constitution that would allow us to move beyond this sort of, there are two parties, I pick my party and that's my team, more so than I'm an American, I'm a Republican, right? Or I'm a Democrat. We want unity. We got to find the things that unite us really and let go of the elephant donkey baloney, is my opinion. Bernie put it way better.
And yeah, I would look forward to an America where Americans are unified and we have a shared sense of what democracy really means. And I mean, we're talking about elections that women, people of color, poor people were not voting in 1860, and yeah, as part of our history. I want to just mention briefly as an individual that we see threads of the Obama is not an American citizen and the birtherism of the 1990s. We see threads of what were part of a general election in 2016, but even in those debates with that candidate, that particular candidate was saying that he wasn't sure he would accept the election. So there's lots of threads to trace back. Individually, I try to read across the spectrum. Again, this isn't with Dr. Vandenberg talking about deep structural changes. And I would certainly appreciate a critique of capitalism in this. But individually, I read across the spectrum, and I do a lot more reading in international publications because the analysis of what's happening in American politics, well, it helps to have an outside perspective, let's just say, at this point. So there are individual things and engagement in less structured traditional forms of protest, or less structured forms of protest, or more social engagement outside of norms that have always been helpful to me and my peace of mind. And I hope, and I know that students are doing the same.
I just want to, we have another comment, and then I would like, and a question, and then we want to get to at least a couple online. So let me get the comment, then let me get the question, and then I have plenty to say, but I will reserve the balance of my time.
Okay, so I just kind of wanted to add a little bit more to that, because I think fundamentally what we're kind of talking about, or like, I guess just kind of sum it all up, is that right now, it's almost kind of like a paradox, because democracy can only survive insofar as it's willing to protect itself. So like, whenever we have a president that continuously tries to undermine like an election, things like that, that is a threat to democracy. And the GOP, even if they like, there are some like few Republicans here and there that says, well, no, or like, you know, Biden was the president, a majority of them still stand behind Trump in everything he does. There's very few dissent. And especially with like Trump firing officials when they have a minor disagreement, I don't know. I just think there's, I would agree with Justin that, yeah, the GOP is, at least for the most part, needs to be dismantled in some way.
Okay, quick question, then we'll go to online.
Okay. Sorry. One of my favorite things to quote is from George Washington, how like he said like political parties will divide people. And I think that's really noticeable today, even though our first president warned about it. And you guys kept talking about peace, but I mean, we all have different opinions and ideas. How will there be peace if there's still people with different opinions?
Different opinions about what?
Just anything really, whether something should be done or something should not be done.
Okay, I think I don't think we need that level of agreement. I think the panelists, Mike and Jennifer and others said it, and Justin said it well, which is we don't need to agree on it. We don't need to, and we hopefully will never agree on all the policy prescriptions and what's the best way to achieve these ends. Those things are inevitably going to be contested. Well, we need something that is a much more fundamental kind of agreement, and that's what Mike and Jennifer and Justin were talking about, which is what are the basic rules of the game? What are the basic fundamental principles? One of which is most certainly you have regular elections, and whoever wins those elections governs, and the losers accept them. And then you try again next time. There's lots of elements of democracy. That's the most fundamental. So if we could agree on that, we would be in perfectly good shape. So I don't think homogenization or sort of a sort of broad agreement on policy should be the goal. It's, do we have a kind of common baseline commitment to democratic norms and procedures? We'll be good if we get that.
Okay, I think right now we're going to go to a couple of online questions.
Yeah. So we have had several, and so just want to pick some that might take us in a little bit of a different direction that we haven't explored. And this one does kind of touch on something that we've talked about a little bit, but it is forward-looking, and so I'm going to try to paraphrase a little bit of this. But so this comes from Daniel. In the wake of the events of 2020, we've seen awareness of the sheer extent of the failings of our existing social safety net and the reluctance of government officials to provide meaningful relief or care, even in the midst of a global pandemic. With countless small business closing and greatly exacerbated housing crisis, the continual lack of affordable health care, lack of living wages, and other related issues still going on. But with both major political parties showing an unwillingness to meaningfully change things, how do we go forward? With entrenched interest being opposed to anything beyond incremental change, how can we effectively respond to problems and continue to become exacerbated? So it's kind of that question about how the parties respond to people and their needs, and I think that gets to some of the underlying issues that Jeff, you mentioned earlier, that are feeding into some of the divisions too.
Well, it's not an easy question. I think that it gets to the underlying divisions of what perhaps historically have been the more traditional party lines in terms of what the role of government should be. Should there be big government, small government? Even though, you know, to violate Jennifer's dichotomy, I would say that, you know, generally speaking, there is no way to look at big government or small government because both, quote unquote, both parties tend to see big government and its merits in some areas and not so much in other areas. I don't know if there's the best way to, if the questioner is asking specifically about what to do in the current situation, it seems like one of the issues that, and my people who look, Jeff and Justin and others who do comparative and international can certainly correct me on this, but it seems to me from looking at it from my vantage point that the parties, when they are trying to determine what, if anything, to do, when we look at other countries and what successful countries have done, seems to have been, and I'm happy to be corrected, more uniform. There tends to be leadership, sort of top-down leadership, at least in the short term, to whether it's mask mandates, whether it's whatever it is, to try to say, okay, if we get through this and we do something about bringing whether it's the level of the disease of the virus or whatnot down, that they don't have to be mutually exclusive, which tends to be something of the conversation, at least among the states, or at least some of the states, that they say, okay, we're going to implement policies, whether it's masks or whatever, distancing, because we want to get back to normal, because we want our economies to, our small businesses to get back to where we were. And there seems to be an argument, and we don't have to get into the constitutionality of it, but people talking about whether their rights are being taken away in the United States. It doesn't seem to be, from my vantage point, the same level. It seems to be of a different level in this country than it is to some of the other countries that, at least at this point, have been a little bit more successful in dealing with the virus.
I would say also we need to get to a point where we stop vilifying the other side and name calling. I don't want to go with the one side does it more than the other, although I think one side does do it more than the other, but I will just say, when you tell people that those people are un-American, and those people hate America, and those people hate God, and those people are evil, and they're out to destroy you, but we're going to compromise with them. We'll work together. It'll be great. That doesn't work, right? They will get primaried. They will get creamed at their next election after hearing that these people are so horrible that you started to actually work with them and come up with solutions and things like that. So if we could stop just completely villainizing the other side or each other, maybe we can come together and solve some problems. We used to be able to do that. That used to be a thing that was possible.
Thank you to Dr. Lineweaver. He has to step off now, so thank you. And we'll continue this. Next question.
Yeah. Ponder, does that mean that the chat that I just sent went to the entire screen?
Not exactly.
Just checking. Yeah. Thanks. I'm glad that was all I wrote. Bye, everybody. That was fun.
Bye.
So next question, I think this may be our last question, but it's very simple and forward-looking. How do you think the divide in our country will affect us in the long run?
How do we think, say that again, how do we think that the divide in our country will affect us in the long run? Well, I think I want to build on something that Greg just said, and Justin left, so I think it's a social science answer, but it's also maybe the feel-good answer. There are certain trends. One of the things I try to look at is trends, and it was never good. But 20, 30 years ago, you used to ask people things like, would you want, somebody of a different race to live in your neighborhood or to, be your child's friend or to marry, okay? That's not so much the case anymore today. What has increased, believe it or not, is people who would say, I don't want. Now, there is some data that shows there's a little bit backing off this, but a few years ago, there was actually an increase in the percentage of people who said, I wouldn't want my child to marry someone of the opposite party. And that got into, really when you start to get to that level, it does start to get, this is just my own opinion, a little bit disheartening, or a lot disheartening. Because then you do, not just from a humanistic standpoint, but also from what political scientists, what we try to do is not just try to explain political trends, but maybe try to offer some answers. But when you get down to that level, it becomes very difficult to identify, this is what we should do. Okay, this is what we should do, and we can get out of polarization. Most of you have probably heard some of these things that even not so long ago, when I was your age, when I was in college down the street at what was then Southwest Missouri State University, I was a political science major, and my friends, whether they were political science majors or not, we would have conversations, and and they could get pretty heated, by the way. For example, neither one of us, when I was in high school, neither one of us knew what the word meant, but I actually had a friend of mine yell at me that I was a bureaucrat, and I was horrified, because that was a terrible thing to be called. I said, I am not, and it turns out I was right. I didn't work in a non-elected capacity for the government. But both of us knew that a bureaucrat was a bad thing to be called. But it was never, I will say this, it was never, maybe I'm glorifying it, I don't think I am, but I remember being friends with people who held diametrically opposed political views, and that wasn't anything that was necessarily specific to me, okay? You saw that all around, and over time, it has become, like I said, it's become much more polarized. I think part of it does lie in the fact that we tend to see people, or not see people, who have different views. Like the statistic that I cited at the beginning, where more than 1 out of 5 people lives in a community where one of the political parties won 75-25. And so and some of you who have been in my 101 class, I have you do a political autobiography. I've had several people in my years here talk about how they literally had never met a Democrat, or literally had never met a Republican until they came to Drury, okay, or to college. And then but then one possibly heartening takeaway here is that they said, and then I got to learn that these people are just like me, they have a different viewpoint. And so I do think if there is a way to begin to have this dialogue, I know it's very easy to say that, but, and I guess if there is a positive outlet to that trend, or outcome to that trend, it is that started to go back a little bit. Now more people, that sort of spiked and it's gone down. But it really was disheartening when you find out, I would not want my child to marry into another party. I think there are other similar types of things that we can do to maybe make our national institutions somewhat more responsive. I do want to push back against, nothing that was said here, but something I see all the time. Most of you, or a lot of you may know that one of my pet peeves, and I've given lots of talks about this, is the Electoral College. And one of the things that is absolutely, in my opinion, incorrect is people who argue for keeping it say, this will really change the way people campaign, this will change the way, what they're supposed to do. With the idea of an Electoral College is to build a coalition of states. But that is not at all the way that it is played out. I always hate to use the percentage 95% because it sounds contrived, but it really is. It's 95% of the candidates, the major party candidates who attend a campaign event in 2012 and 2016, and of course not 2020 because it was a very different time, obviously, are concentrated in 12 states. Okay, now to put it another way, the other 5% of visits by the candidate seeking votes is spread out among the other 38 states. If we do something, and of course I would like us just to get rid of the Electoral College, but I think other types of things such as moving to a congressional district system like they have in Nebraska or Maine, ways to make, if you are, there's literally no reason for, let's say, a Democrat to go to one of the Dakotas, or there's no real reason for a Republican to go to California right now. But if we got rid of those things, there absolutely would be. And I'm not saying that that would fix everything, but that would be, I absolutely agree with Jeff about changing our electoral system. And maybe changing the electoral college is as likely as changing our electoral system, which is to say, not very, not very high. But things like this would start to, I think, some reform, some serious rethinking of how we go about doing politics, whether it's elections, whether it's interest group mediation, whether it is political parties. Right now, as Justin mentioned and Jeff expanded on, right now our electoral systems really only allow for 2 parties. There's lots of parties. Now you might go to to an election and say, well, when I went and voted, there were 7 or 8 parties. But in reality, a single member district, first past the post system, only allows for 2. A winner-take-all system in the Electoral College only allows for certain types of states, and oftentimes somewhat smaller and less representative, to be to almost dictate, not quite dictate, but come close to dictating some of our electoral outcomes. So I do think, to give a social science answer, and possibly that's sort of the joy and the downside of living in the ivory tower, because they may not happen, or it may not happen anytime soon. But I think basic rethinking of our electoral institutions, how we go about, to say nothing of how the institutions themselves work. That's a whole nother story that we could talk about. But I do think that rethinking some of these basic things that we have come to understand and know and be comfortable with are worth continuing to talk about.
Can I just jump in here? I love that. I am so curious how, given what Dr. Groves has talked about and everybody has talked about, is just the extreme media fragmentation, how we get from using the channels we have at our disposal. I mean, there's obviously so much to change at once, but how we get from our current system to a much more complex system, like a revisioning in a climate where every single word can be monetized for different candidates. The idea that, for example, there's an intergenerational understanding of concepts, but then are themselves mediated. For example, Nancy Pelosi, born in the United States before we entered World War I, and an understanding of what socialism meant in 1940, and AOC, a congresswoman from New York, born in 1989, 3 years after the Challenger disaster, and what socialism to a new generation means: Scandinavian countries that have proportional representation and a whole different economic distribution system. So just this is a layperson now asking our colleagues, how do we get to an entirely new political structure in an era where fundraising for candidates is operating on these hyper politicization, hyper polarization? It just seems like a difficult journey.
I think there's another complicating factor, Jennifer. Okay. On top of all of the issues that you've raised, which are solid issues that I'm not sure what we do about it, because I mentioned earlier the importance of distrust in everything of our society. So distrust of institutions, distrust of media and the messages that we receive. And then one thing we really haven't talked about in all of this is distrust of expertise. So now, because of Google and because of the internet, we know everything, right? Our doctors aren't going to prescribe the solution to our medical issues. I'm going to look at WebMD and I can fix the problem. I don't need a mechanic anymore. I go to YouTube and it's going to have me fix the car. So all of a sudden I'm getting this false confidence that I can do anything with the internet, including solving all the problems in our country. We could fix climate change if we just did this. We could solve all of our issues, right? And I think that's where we want simple solutions to complex issues, and we don't have the patience for the complexity and the nuance anymore because everything is reductive, and I don't know what we do about that. It's just what do we? I'm just adding to it, not helping.
Yeah, I want to add, sort of jump in there because that's kind of where I was going a little bit with. I thought, this. It's very difficult. That's the good part about living in the ivory tower, and also the bad part. I mean, and part of this is I do think that these electoral reforms that we've talked about, one of the problems, and this is where I tend to get disheartened a little bit, is human nature. I mean, our institutions and our guardrails are there, but they are not self-executing. They require people, and if we were going to make one of the things that sort of jumps out to me a lot of times is when people say, we need to get back to the framers, what the framers said, we need to go back to the Federalist Papers. With all due respect to those people, and I see where they're coming from, I wonder sometimes if they've read the Federalist Papers, because what the Federalist Papers is all about compromise, conciliation, the political process as the art of the possible through compromise. And so to move from an SMD-FPP system, or to move from an electoral college system, or to move from any institutional reforms that we could talk about within the institution itself, the institutions themselves, would require people to give up something that they have and value. And that, I think, is a big problem.
I don't have a solution, but I do want to add a different tone for a moment, and that is so. And I contributed to it, admittedly. The tone, things are not great. I said it just like that, but it's a sort of a sad irony that we're having this conversation because there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened in the election in 2020 that should be quite heartening, incredibly heartening. Voter turnout was incredible in the 2020 election. Young people's voter turnout was 7, 8, 9% higher than normal. So people's attentiveness to public issues, caring about it, trying to do something about it, is extraordinarily high. There's representation that's happening in government in 2020. More women Republicans are in office now than ever. You have an African American elected in Georgia. You have a Jewish citizen in Georgia elected. There's all sorts of incredible things that happened that are just that unfortunately the events, especially January 6th, have wiped from the forefront of our minds. But I don't want us to lose sight of that also. Participation by itself doesn't fix it. You need solutions. But nonetheless, I think we should be pretty heartened by some of the things that we saw in terms of the resiliency of democracy. And there were a lot of stress tests, but there were a whole bunch of people, Republican leaders in Congress, who faced with the ultimate question, are we going to allow the undoing of a democratic election, who said, no, that's not, we're not doing that. At the last moment, they said no. Vice President Pence was under incredible pressure, violent pressure, and he said no, I'm not doing that. Mitch McConnell, these are Republicans who stood up and said democracy is more important than the party. And so I think there's a lot to be heartened by, and maybe we might want to add that to the mix of our overall assessment.
Well, I told Dr. Ponder, that I've become a lot more cynical lately, and maybe he didn't want me up here. I would just say to your rosy assessment about those things that you think are great, about half the country are very threatened and upset about. So I don't know what you do with that.
Anything else from our panel? All right, well, I want to thank again Dr. Cloyd, Dr. Harville for bringing this idea to us. I want to thank the people who are here. I want to thank, I know we didn't get much of a chance for those of you on online, but I think that was a function of vigorous debate, which is also a hallmark of democracy and one of the things that we like to do here at Drury and the Metter Center. And so I want to thank all of you for coming out, and we'll be in touch again soon. Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.